Breaking tonight, a red notice is flying across borders. Signed in Europe, echoed in Washington, stamped in Interpol's ink. But in Africa, it lands like a boomerang. Wanted. By whom? For what? For saying gold belongs to African children, not foreign banks? For daring to fuel African homes before Parisian lights? And here's the irony. The louder the warrant screams, the clearer the mask slips. Justice, or just another export in disguise. The twist. What was meant to chain one soldier may have unchained an entire continent. The headline they drafted in fear has turned into the headline they never wanted you to read. Before we move forward, let me ask you something personal. Where are you watching from right now? Are you tuning in from New York, from Lagos, from Paris, or maybe from Atlanta? And when you hear about justice on the world stage, do you trust the headlines, or do you trust your own eyes? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know your perspective, your habits, your truth. This is Africa Daily. Good news. A channel that cuts through the noise, connects the dots, and speaks to Americans, Africans, and anyone who still believes freedom isn't a crime scene. So if you believe dignity matters, hit that subscribe button, tap like, and share this story with someone who still thinks Africa bows to anyone. Now, let's take a closer look, because the real news doesn't start with the warrant itself. It starts with the machinery behind it, and the question that always follows: who benefits when Africa says no? Imagine this: a piece of paper with no judge, no courtroom, no trial. Yet it can freeze bank accounts, trigger airport alarms, and brand a man across the world as a criminal before he ever speaks. That is the power of an Interpol red notice, and today, that power is pointed at Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré. On paper, the notice looks technical, almost bureaucratic. It is not a conviction. It is not even formal charges. It is a signal: detain this person. And once that signal is sent across borders, stigma travels faster than facts. Governments treat it like proof, media treats it like guilt, and ordinary people are left to wonder whether law is still law or just politics in uniform. But here's the catch. The very tool designed to isolate a leader is now isolating Interpol itself. Neutrality, the badge it wears so proudly, is being questioned. Africans scroll their phones, compare headlines, and ask quietly, if this is justice, why did it never apply to colonizers, to corporations that drained gold from West Africa, or to soldiers who marched under foreign flags? That question doesn't stay quiet for long. Think about human behavior. When someone at work is singled out unfairly, others usually watch in silence until the punishment feels too absurd. Then something shifts. People whisper, they question, and finally they resist. The same psychology is unfolding here. The warrant meant to frighten is instead fueling defiance. And after all, history shows that people rarely rally around the paperwork of power. They rally around the person they feel is being targeted unjustly. Let me give you a story. In Ouagadougou last week, a young student told a local reporter, "If our president is wanted for saying gold belongs here, then I must be wanted too, because I believe the same." That sentence spread online faster than the warrant itself. It was short, human, relatable, and it hit a nerve far beyond Burkina Faso, echoing across African news cycles and even into Western comment sections where viewers started asking whether justice had lost its meaning. Now, pause and think. How would most Americans react if a foreign body declared their leader wanted, not for crimes against humanity, but for changing a contract on oil or gold? Most would laugh at the absurdity. Some would rage. Many would call it foreign interference. So why should Africans react any differently? This is where the paradox lives. The warrant is less about legal danger and more about perception. It tells African citizens, your sovereignty has limits, but the reaction is telling the opposite story. That maybe, finally, those limits no longer hold. And if ordinary people begin to see the system itself as biased, then the authority of the warrant collapses under its own weight. The mood is shifting, and with it the balance of fear. What was once a stamp of control is beginning to look like a badge of exposure. And that exposure leads us naturally into the next layer. Because the question is not just about a single piece of paper. It is about the timing, the resources at stake, and the alliances that suddenly seem too threatening for the old order to ignore. What a coincidence, or maybe not. Just weeks after Burkina Faso announced stricter control over its gold exports and signaled new plans for uranium sovereignty, suddenly a red notice appeared with Ibrahim Traoré's name on it. Coincidence doesn't usually arrive this punctual. The record shows that Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, has been drawing closer under the Sahel Alliance. Together, these countries hold gold reserves, uranium deposits, and oil routes critical to Europe's lights and industry. When they said openly, "Our resources must serve our people first," the mood in Paris and Brussels changed overnight. And then, not long after, Interpol's machinery turned on. The timing alone raises eyebrows. Why now? Why this leader? And why only when supply chains look threatened? Let's put it in human terms. Think about your own paycheck. Imagine you decide to stop sending half of it to a neighbor who never helped you, and suddenly the homeowners association posts your name on a blacklist. Is that justice, or is it leverage disguised as law? Most Americans would push back immediately. They would say, "It's my money, my labor, my choice." That's the same logic Africans are applying to their gold, oil, and uranium. But here comes the twist hidden in plain sight. On the surface, the warrant targets a man. Beneath the surface, it warns every leader on the continent. Do not tamper with contracts, do not shift alliances, do not close the tap that feeds our industries. The red ink is less about law enforcement and more about reminding Africa of its supposed place. And yet, the reminder is having the opposite effect. The more the pressure rises, the more defiant the response becomes. One short story captures this mood. In a small mining town near Kaya, workers saw trucks carrying ore out of the country as usual. But this time, when news broke that Traoré had been flagged abroad, one miner told his friends, if they fear him, it's because he finally said out loud what we've been living in silence. That remark, simple and raw, spread among the workers faster than any official press release. It connected the dots between their daily sweat and the international headlines flashing on their screens. After all, people everywhere share one instinct. If a system punishes someone for defending what feels fair, the punishment loses credibility. Americans often complain about corporate monopolies shaping prices. Africans see the same pattern, only on a continental scale. Different context, same frustration. And once that connection clicks, labels like destabilizing or dangerous stop working. The paradox is clear. A red notice meant to intimidate is instead spotlighting the very contracts and resource flows outsiders wanted, kept quiet. It drags hidden boardroom deals into public debate, and suddenly citizens ask, who really benefits from our gold, our uranium, our oil? That rising curiosity leads directly into the next dimension, because once history is recalled, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Leaders before Traoré carried the same vision, paid the same price, and left a warning written in their own bloodlines. And their names are not forgotten. Strange how the world's villains keep switching faces. One decade it's Patrice Lumumba, the next it's Thomas Sankara, then Nelson Mandela. Each time the charge is different, dangerous, reckless, even terrorist, but the pattern is identical. And today, Ibrahim Traoré wears the same label. News archives show it clearly. In 1960, Lumumba of Congo declared that Congolese minerals should serve Congolese citizens. Within months, he was overthrown and assassinated. His crime was not corruption, but courage. 2 decades later, Burkina Faso's own Sankara insisted that food sovereignty mattered more than aid packages, that debt was a chain disguised as generosity. He was silenced at 37, cut down in his own capital. Mandela, branded a terrorist, spent 27 years in a cell before history rewrote his title to freedom icon. Different eras, different headlines, but the script never changes. Those who demand sovereignty are first punished, then praised. Here's where the story turns on itself. Each of these leaders was once presented to global audiences as a destabilizer. Yet years later, their words inspire textbooks, rallies, and movements across continents. That irony is impossible to miss. And maybe you've seen the same in your own life, when someone at work or in your community is branded a problem, only for everyone to realize later they were simply telling the truth too early. Human instinct is slow to reward defiance, but once it does, the labels fade fast. Consider a short story from South Africa. During the late 1980s, a young American exchange student walked through Johannesburg and saw posters with Mandela's face marked terrorist. She returned home confused. Her professors called him a hero, yet the headlines called him criminal. Decades later, that same woman told her children, "The world lies about its enemies until it needs new heroes." That observation still resonates, because the same dissonance is unfolding today with Traoré. So let me ask you quietly, when you hear the word destabilizing leader, do you picture chaos? Or do you picture someone refusing to obey an order written abroad? The answer isn't printed in newspapers. It sits inside each viewer who compares headlines with lived reality. What's striking is how repetition creates both fatigue and awakening. Older Africans remember the betrayals of Lumumba and Sankara. Younger Africans, raised in the digital age, watch Traoré's speeches on their phones and recognize the echo. And recognition changes behavior. According to studies on generational memory, when people see patterns repeating, they are more likely to resist the cycle rather than endure it. That's why the warrant, instead of silencing, is sparking debate in classrooms, markets, and even military barracks. The emotional weight here cannot be dismissed. Each name, Lumumba, Sankara, Mandela, represents unfinished chapters. Traoré is now being inserted into that lineage, not by choice, but by the very system trying to suppress him. And once you're in that lineage, the label of criminal loses its sting. History has already exposed the trick. This realization leads naturally to the next stage. Because once the memory of fallen leaders blends with the energy of a rising generation, the struggle is no longer about one man. It becomes about millions who refuse to let the cycle repeat. And that collective mood is starting to move from whispers to visible action. The irony is brutal. A warrant designed to shrink one voice has ended up amplifying millions. Instead of silence, it sparked lecture hall debates, market stall arguments, even late-night conversations in military barracks. In Burkina Faso, students write about it in essays. In Lagos, hashtags trend by dawn. In New York, African immigrants discuss it over dinner tables. The supposed message of fear has been flipped into proof that the old order is running scared. Look at the demographics. Over 60% of Africa's population is under 25. That means most Africans today never lived through colonial rule directly. They don't carry the memory of submission, they carry smartphones, data bundles, and a global stage that listens in real time. For them, a red notice isn't intimidation, it's confirmation. Confirmation that their leaders' words about sovereignty hit exactly where it hurts. And notice the human parallel. When people in America see a coworker punished for raising a fair question, say, asking about equal pay or health care, what happens? At first, others keep quiet. But as soon as they realize the punishment is unfair, they talk. Then they organize. The same psychology is unfolding across Africa. What was meant as warning is now a rallying cry. Here's a short story that captures the ground-level shift. In a gold mining village near Bobo Dioulasso, a group of workers watched trucks hauling ore under armed guard. One miner turned to the others and said, "If protecting our gold is a crime, then every one of us is guilty." That single line spread through WhatsApp groups like wildfire. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't staged, it was raw truth, and people felt it. The mood is unmistakable. Farmers who once sold crops for export now talk about food sovereignty. Workers in Niger discuss unionizing across borders. Young Africans post side-by-side comparisons. Western leaders praised for defending their economies. African leaders punished for doing the same. The question lingers quietly: why should sovereignty look different depending on the continent? And after all, once people see the double standard, it's hard to unsee. According to social behavior research, when individuals recognize hypocrisy and authority, compliance drops sharply. In America, this shows up in consumer boycotts. In Africa, it's showing up in defiance of foreign dictates. That shift is dangerous, not for the people, but for those who relied on quiet obedience. The emotional curve keeps rising. What began as suspicion has become confidence. The warrant is no longer about Traoré. It is about the miners, the farmers, the students who see themselves reflected in the accusation. And when millions begin to identify with one man's struggle, the balance of fear tilts, which leads us directly to the next stage of the story. Because when resistance stops being individual and becomes collective, the question is no longer if the movement exists. The question becomes, how far is it willing to go? Here's the paradox. The more Western capitals try to contain the Sahel, the more the region begins to move on its own. What was once described as fragile states is now rebranded by their own people as the Alliance of Sahel States, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, pooling strength, not begging for it. For decades, the story was dependency. Today, the plot twist is autonomy. News reports confirm the shift. The alliance isn't just military, it is economic. Talks of local refineries, regional value chains, and border security are moving from theory into policy. And that matters because this bloc sits on critical reserves: gold, uranium, and potential oil corridors. Paris knows it, Brussels knows it, Washington knows it. When those resources stop flowing out uncontested, the balance of leverage tilts, but the twist deepens. The diplomatic tone is changing too. Where African leaders once entered summits as petitioners, today they speak as equals. They reject aid packages with hidden conditions, they renegotiate mining licenses, they demand a greater share for their citizens. It is subtle but profound. The language of dependency has been replaced by the language of sovereignty. Think about this in human terms. Imagine an employee who, for years, quietly accepted a paycheck that never covered the rent. One day, they demand fair wages. At first, the company panics. Then, it threatens. But once that demand is voiced, there is no going back. Most Americans understand this instinctively. Once you realize your labor has value, silence is no longer an option. Africa is experiencing the same awakening, only on a continental scale. A short story brings this home. In Niamey, Niger, after French troops withdrew, a local teacher told his class, "For the first time, our skies feel like ours." The children clapped. Some laughed nervously, not used to such bold words. But the teacher's face stayed serious. That moment, small and local, captured the larger shift. The psychological border had moved. Sovereignty was no longer an abstract term. It was something you could feel in the air. Meanwhile, Western media frames the same shift with words like instability and risk. On the ground, Africans call it renewal and dignity. The contrast is striking. For investors, sovereignty looks like disruption. For citizens, it looks like justice finally arriving. And once that perception gap grows too wide, narratives collapse. After all, if people don't believe the official story loses its teeth. The implications stretch beyond the Sahel. From South Africa to Ghana, leaders are watching closely. If Burkina Faso can hold its ground, what stops others from following? If one bloc of nations can set new rules, then the old system no longer dictates the terms. That possibility alone unsettles boardrooms in Europe and policy desks in Washington. The mood has risen steadily from suspicion to defiance and now to pride. A coalition once dismissed as temporary is solidifying into a model. And models, once they exist, are hard to erase. Which brings us to the next turn, because when perception shifts and alliances hold, the battlefield is no longer contracts or armies. It becomes the narrative itself. Who tells the story, who defines the criminal, and who defines the hero? Here's the contradiction. The red notice was supposed to be a symbol of authority, but it's ending up as proof of weakness. The more it circulates, the more it exposes itself. Neutral tools don't need to scream. Only political ones do. And audiences, whether in Ouagadougou or New York, are sharper than they were 20 years ago. They scroll, compare, and connect dots. From a news perspective, every sanction, every diplomatic threat, every Interpol headline carries less weight because it confirms a suspicion already forming. The system is not neutral. It protects contracts, not communities. It defends supply chains, not sovereignty. And once people start believing that, the machinery loses credibility faster than it can issue the next notice. But think about the human side. Most Americans know the feeling of questioning authority. Maybe it's when a company suddenly raises prices while claiming inflation, or when a politician preaches sacrifice while enjoying perks. At first, people accept it. Then frustration builds. And finally, one moment snaps them out of it. For Africans, the warrant is that moment, a tipping point where obedience no longer feels logical. Here's a short story that illustrates the change. In Dakar, a young woman was asked by a foreign journalist what she thought of Traoré's warrant. She paused, then replied, "If they fear him, maybe he is finally doing his job." That sentence carried more weight than any editorial. It turned suspicion into conviction, and it reminded everyone listening that fear can flip sides. And maybe that's the twist hiding in plain sight. The warrant is no longer about law enforcement, it's about perception. Once the label criminal attaches to someone defending sovereignty, the label itself collapses. History has already shown us this with Lumumba, with Sankara, with Mandela. Add Traoré to that list, and the pattern becomes undeniable. So let me ask quietly, when a system keeps calling reformers threats, do we still trust the system, or do we start trusting the people standing against it? That's the question ordinary citizens are beginning to answer for themselves, not through press conferences, but through choices. Miners speaking out, farmers keeping crops at home, students posting online without fear. The mood has climbed from suspicion to defiance, and now it settles into clarity. The real contest isn't in courtrooms or conference halls. It's in perception, and perception, once changed, is almost impossible to reverse. Which leads naturally to the closing moment. Because when millions shift from silence to speech, when fear moves from the people to the powerful, the story is no longer about one man in Burkina Faso. It becomes about an entire continent deciding that dignity is not up for negotiation. And that realization sets the stage for how this chapter ends, and how the next one begins. Strange, isn't it? A single sheet of paper stamped in Lyon was supposed to scare a nation, yet it ended up shaking the legitimacy of the very system that wrote it. The Interpol warrant against Ibrahim Traoré was drafted as law, but it reads more like leverage, and leverage only works as long as people stay silent. From the news angle, the story is simple. The red notice is not a conviction, not even a charge, but the moment it touched African soil, it triggered questions that no courtroom could contain. Why were colonizers never named? Why were corporations that stripped mines never summoned? Why does justice suddenly arrive only when sovereignty begins to rise? These aren't just rhetorical questions. They're headlines waiting to be written by those who live the consequences. And from the human angle, the transformation is undeniable. Think about behavior we all know. Most Americans, when they see unfair rules at work, like wage cuts while executives take bonuses, don't react right away. But once the hypocrisy is visible, loyalty shifts. People talk, they organize, and they resist. The same arc is now unfolding across Africa. The warrant became a mirror, and in that reflection, citizens no longer saw guilt. They saw confirmation that power fears change. Let me share a story. In Bamako, Mali, a grandmother was asked by her grandson what an Interpol notice meant. She answered softly, "It means they are afraid of him." For the boy, it was a bedtime explanation. For the continent, it was a generational truth. Simple, honest, and impossible to erase. And maybe that's the twist of history itself. Leaders once painted as criminals are remembered as visionaries. The empire keeps recycling the same labels, but audiences no longer buy the product. Because after decades of slavery, colonization, and dependency, Africans know the difference between law and leverage. And once that knowledge spreads, the fear that once belonged to them now belongs to the other side. So let me ask you, when you watch this, wherever you are, do you see a threat to world peace or a threat to an old system of control? That answer isn't mine to dictate. It's yours to comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what sovereignty means in your own daily life. Because connection, whether from New York, Chicago, Lagos, or Ouagadougou, turns stories into solidarity. This is Africa Daily. Good news. If you believe dignity should never be branded as criminal, subscribe, share this story, and let the algorithm know Africa's voice deserves the stage. And as we close, remember, a warrant may linger on paper, but it cannot handcuff a continent. A notice may carry red ink, but it cannot erase history's direction. What began as fear has already become defiance. And what feels like an ending is only the beginning of the next chapter Africa is writing for itself.